The dust of the high plains was the first thing and the last thing. It was the alpha and the omega of Clementine Shaw's world, a world that measured 8 years old but felt as ancient and worn as the eroded hills that cupped their homestead like a callous hand. At dawn, the dust was a soft, rosy ghost, stirred by a cool wind that carried the scent of sage and distant rain that never fell. By noon, it was a white-hot torment, clinging to the sweat on her neck. And at dusk, as the sun bled out behind the Sawtooth Mountains, it settled once more, a fine, gritty shroud over every surface, a constant reminder of the dryness in her own throat, the barrenness in her own small heart. This morning, the dust motes danced in the single beam of light slanting through the grimy kitchen window, illuminating the fresh mark on her arm. It was an angry, purple-red welt, the ghost of a wooden spoon's kiss, blooming just below the sleeve of her faded calico nightgown. She traced its edge with a hesitant finger, the skin hot and tight. It was a secret map of her life, this cartography of pain. There were older, faded continents on her back, archipelagos of small, round bruises on her legs, each one a memory, a lesson in silence. The house was still, a dangerous, breathing stillness. The floorboards held their breath, waiting. The old grandfather clock in the hall seemed to tick softer, counting down not to the hour, but to the waking of the monster. Magdalena, her stepmother. The word itself was a shard of glass in her mind. Clementine slid from her narrow bed, her bare feet making no sound on the splintered wood. Every movement was a calculation of silence, a choreography learned through brutal repetition. She bypassed the creaky fourth step on the staircase, held her breath as she passed the closed door to the master bedroom, where Magdalena slept beside her father, a father who returned from the black lungs of the coal mine each night, too coated in dust and fatigue to see the subtler, more vicious darkness that had taken root in his own home. Zeke Shaw was a good man, a gentle giant with calloused hands and a heart that Clementine remembered as warm, but his goodness was a distant, sleeping thing, buried under a mountain of exhaustion. He saw a wife who kept a clean house and a quiet daughter. He did not see the terror that scrubbed the floors or the fear that choked the child's words. In the kitchen, another ghost lingered. The wooden spoon lay clean and dry by the sink, innocent in the morning light. Beside it, coiled on a hook by the back door, was the worn leather strap. It was thick and dark with age and use, its surface cracked like parched earth. The strap was for bigger sins, for moments when the spoon's sharp rebuke was not enough. It was the high priest of Magdalena's cruel religion, and Clementine was its only parishioner. She eased the back door open, the latch clicking with a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. She froze, listening. Only the low moan of the wind answered. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, a welcome shock after the stale fear of the house. She ran, her small legs pumping, her nightgown fluttering behind her like a pale flag of surrender. She ran past the skeletal remains of a vegetable garden Magdalena had abandoned, past the rusting carcass of an old buckboard, towards the one place on this 100-acre parcel of misery that was sacred, the barn. The great wooden doors groaned open under her weight, revealing a cavern of cool, sweet-smelling darkness. The air was thick with the scent of hay, dust, and animal warmth. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of him. He stood in his stall, a shadow within shadows, immense and silent. Thunder. He was a creature of myth, a black stallion so large he seemed to have been carved from the midnight rock of the mountains themselves. His coat drank the dim light, offering no reflection, only a profound, living blackness. When he moved, it was with the fluid power of a storm gathering on the horizon. But now, he was still, his head lowered as she approached. He was not her pet. He was not even truly her family's horse. He was a wild thing her father had found injured a year ago, a magnificent beast with a proud bloodline someone had foolishly tried to break and failed. Zeke had brought him back, splinted his leg, and intended to sell him once he healed. but the horse would allow no one near him except the small, quiet girl who brought him water and whispered secrets to him when no one was watching. He tolerated Zeke. He ignored Magdalena. He belonged to Clementine. She slipped through the rails of his stall and pressed her face into the solid warmth of his neck. His scent filled her senses, earthy and alive, chasing away the metallic tang of fear. His winter coat was thick and soft, and she tangled her fingers in his coarse mane, anchoring herself to him. He made a low, rumbling sound in his chest, a vibration that traveled through her own small body, loosening the knot of terror in her stomach. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement that wrapped his presence around her like a living shield. Here, in the cathedral of his strength, she was not a victim. She was not a target. She was just a girl, and she was safe. She whispered into his skin, the words a secret prayer. She told him about the spoon, about the fire in her arm, about the coldness in Magdalena's eyes. He listened, his great head still, his ear twitching to catch her tiny voice. He could not understand the words, but he understood the melody of her pain. He had known pain himself, the sting of a whip, the bite of a cruel bit. He knew the language of suffering, and he knew the language of loyalty. He nudged her gently with his massive head, a gesture of such tenderness it made her want to weep. This was their ritual, their secret communion in the fragile moments between the darkness and the dawn. It was the only thing that kept the pieces of her from shattering. The bond between them was a silent, unbreakable thread, woven in a world that offered nothing else to hold on to. He was her guardian, her confessor, her only true family. And as the sun began to climb higher, casting longer, sharper shadows across the yard, the dread returned. Soon, the house would be fully awake. Soon, Magdalena would call her name, and the voice would not be kind. Clementine gave Thunder one last, desperate hug, breathing him in, trying to store up his strength like a squirrel hoarding nuts for a long, cruel winter. She slipped from the stall, her hand trailing along his flank, a final, fleeting touch. He watched her go, his eyes dark, intelligent pools of knowing. He was more than a horse. He was a witness. And in the vast, silent plains of justice, a witness is a powerful thing. She closed the barn doors behind her, the sound a final, mournful toll, and turned to face the house, squaring her small shoulders for the battle of another day. The welt on her arm throbbed, a steady, rhythmic reminder of what awaited her. The sun was up now, and the world was awake. The peace was over. The days that followed bled into one another, a uniform gray of dread and duty. Clementine moved through her chores with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, her presence in the house tolerated only as long as she was useful and invisible. She swept floors that were already clean, dusted furniture that held no memories worth preserving, and scrubbed pots until her knuckles were raw. Each task was a minefield, a missed spot of dust, a fork placed incorrectly, a moment of stillness perceived as laziness. Any of these could trigger Magdalena's cold, simmering rage. The cruelty was a living thing, an inventive, probing entity. It was not always the sharp, hot sting of the spoon or the strap. Sometimes it was the denial of food, a plate given, and then snatched away with a sneer about her being too skinny to be worth the feed. Sometimes it was verbal, a stream of poison whispered just loud enough for her to hear, words that chipped away at her soul. Useless, stupid, an ungrateful little rat your father saddled me with. The worst was when Magdalena would speak of Clementine's mother, a woman she'd never known, who had died giving birth to her. Magdalena painted her as a weak, frail creature, and Clementine as the flaw that had killed her. "You were born of death," she hissed one afternoon, her face close, her breath smelling of stale coffee, "and you bring it with you." Zeke remained a ship passing in the night. He would leave before dawn, his lunch pail in his hand, his face already smudged with yesterday's coal. He would return after dusk, a man carved from shadow, his body aching, his mind numb. He would eat the meal Magdalena placed before him, his eyes heavy-lidded, his conversation limited to grunts and tired monosyllables. He would see his daughter, a small, quiet shape at the end of the table, and ask, "Everything all right, Clem?" And Clementine, feeling Magdalena's sharp gaze on her like the point of a knife, would nod. "Yes, Papa." What could she say? How could she explain a terror that had no single shape, a pain that was woven into the very fabric of her days? He would not understand. He loved Magdalena, or at least the version of her he saw, the efficient wife, the woman who had brought order to his widower's chaos. To speak against her would be a betrayal he couldn't comprehend, and the consequences, the retribution she would face from Magdalena once he was gone, were unthinkable. So she remained silent, a keeper of secrets, protecting her oblivious father from a truth that would shatter his world, and protecting herself from a wrath that would surely break her. But Magdalena was beginning to notice something. She was beginning to understand that while she could control Clementine's body with pain and her mind with fear, she could not touch her spirit. There was a core of resilience in the child, a quiet strength that she could not break, and she began to suspect its source. She watched from the kitchen window as Clementine, thinking she was unobserved, would steal away to the barn. She saw the way the girl's shoulders, perpetually hunched in the house, would straighten as she approached the corral. She saw the way the massive black stallion would come to the fence, lowering his head to meet the child's touch. The sight curdled something in her. It was a relationship beyond her control, a fortress she could not breach. The horse gave the girl something Magdalena was determined to stamp out, a sense of worth, a feeling of being loved. Her jealousy, a small, venomous snake, began to uncoil in her gut. It wasn't just about the girl anymore. It was about the horse. The beast, as she called him. It stood as a symbol of everything she despised: wildness, loyalty, a spirit that refused to be broken. And it was the source of Clementine's infuriating resilience. The girl's love for the horse was a rebellion, a silent act of defiance. To truly conquer the child, to grind her spirit into the same fine dust that covered the land, she would have to destroy the source of that rebellion. She would have to destroy Thunder. The idea took root slowly, a dark seed planted in the barren soil of her soul. At first it was just a fantasy. The horse sold, gone. Then it became more violent. The horse crippled, broken. Her gaze would linger on Zeke's hunting rifle, mounted on the wall over the fireplace. The thought was intoxicating. But a gunshot would be too loud, too obvious. It would require explanation. No, it had to be something else. Something that looked like an accident, or something that asserted her dominance in a way that was both punishment and lesson. Her focus shifted from Clementine's small transgressions to the horse itself. She complained to Zeke that the stallion was eating too much feed, that he was a dangerous, unpredictable animal. Zeke, tired and distracted, would just shake his head. "He's a good horse, Maggie, and Clem loves him." That was the mistake. Clem loves him. The words echoed in Magdalena's mind, sealing Thunder's fate. It was the love she had to extinguish. The love was the real enemy. The air on the homestead grew thick with a new kind of tension. It was no longer just about Clementine avoiding her stepmother's wrath. Now, a protective instinct, fierce and desperate, rose in her. She started doing her chores faster, trying to earn more time to spend in the barn, as if her presence alone could keep Thunder safe. She watched Magdalena constantly, trying to read the flicker in her cold eyes, to anticipate her next move. The physical recurrences of their private war became more pronounced. Clementine found herself pressing her face into Thunder's neck with a new urgency, not just for comfort, but as if trying to absorb his strength, to physically merge with his power. And Thunder, in turn, became more overtly her guardian. If Magdalena was in the yard when Clementine was with him, the stallion would subtly, deliberately, position his massive body between them. He would stand like a mountain of black muscle, a living wall, his gaze fixed on the woman, a low rumble sometimes vibrating in his chest. He was no longer a passive refuge. He was an active protector. The escalation was inevitable. It came on a Tuesday, A day of suffocating heat and a sky the color of bleached bone. Zeke had taken on a double shift at the mine. They would be alone until long after dark. Clementine had finished her morning tasks and was in the corral, brushing Thunder's flank, her small hand moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. It was a moment of peace, a tiny island in a sea of anxiety. Then the back door of the house slammed shut. Clementine's head snapped up. Magdalena was marching across the yard, her face a mask of grim determination. Her stride was stiff, purposeful, and in her hand she carried the worn leather strap. A cold dread, sharper and more sickening than anything she had ever felt before, seized Clementine. She had felt the strap on her own skin 100 times, but this was different. Magdalena wasn't looking at her. Her eyes, narrowed and glinting with a malevolent fire, were fixed on the horse. "Get away from that beast!" Magdalena's voice was flat, devoid of the usual shrill anger. It was colder, more dangerous. "No," Clementine whispered, her hand tightening on the brush. "I said, get away from him." Clementine didn't move. She stood her ground, her small body trembling, trying to shield the massive animal behind her. It was a pathetically brave, hopelessly foolish gesture. She was a sapling trying to protect an oak tree. "He didn't do anything," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "He exists," Magdalena said, a world of venom in those two words. "That's enough. I'm going to teach this animal some manners. And you're going to watch." The terror inside Clementine was absolute. This was not about punishment. This was about desecration. Magdalena was going to invade her sanctuary, defile her one source of goodness and love, and force her to witness it. The worn leather strap, for so long a symbol of her own private suffering, was now being turned on the only innocent thing in her life. The nature of evil was revealing a new, more horrifying depth. It didn't just want to cause pain, it wanted to obliterate love itself. Magdalena raised the strap. The sun caught the dark, cracked leather. The air grew still and heavy, charged with the coming storm. Thunder, who had been standing quietly, shifted his weight. His head came up, his ears swiveled forward, and his nostrils flared. He was no longer a gentle giant. He was alert, coiled, a predator assessing a threat. He took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Clementine, reversing their positions. He was shielding her now. The quiet solace was over. The terrified defiance had begun. Magdalena saw the horse's movement not as a warning, but as a challenge. A smirk twisted her lips. This was exactly what she wanted. A fight, a chance to break something beautiful. "You stupid animal," she spat, and brought the strap down in a vicious, whistling arc aimed at Thunder's powerful shoulders. The world seemed to slow down. Clementine let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure anguish. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the sickening thwack of leather on flesh. But the sound never came. Instead, there was a sharp, tearing noise, like canvas ripping, and a grunt of pained surprise from Magdalena. Clementine's eyes flew open. What she saw defied belief. Thunder had moved with a speed that was impossible for an animal his size. It was not the panicked, rearing motion of a frightened horse. It was a movement of breathtaking precision and intelligence. As the strap descended, he had lunged forward, not away, and caught the descending leather in his massive teeth. With a violent, bone-jarring shake of his head, he ripped the strap clean from Magdalena's grasp. It flew through the air and landed in the dust a dozen feet away. Magdalena stared at her empty hand, then at the horse, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The strap, her symbol of power, her instrument of control, lay useless in the dirt. The horse had not just defied her, he had disarmed her. He had met her violence with an act of calm, calculated superiority. Thunder stood his ground, the torn end of the strap still jutting from the side of his mouth like a grim cigar. He hadn't harmed her. He hadn't reared or charged. He had simply made a statement. "You have no power here." His eyes, dark and fathomless, were locked on her. In them, for the first time, Magdalena saw not a dumb beast, but an equal. an adversary. Her shock curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. Her face contorted, becoming something ugly and feral. You monster! She shrieked, her voice cracking. She looked around wildly, for a rock, a stick, anything to reclaim her dominance. It was in that moment of shattered authority and screeching rage that a third sound entered the tableau, the low rumble of an engine, followed by the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. All three of them, the furious woman, the terrified child, and the magnificent, defiant stallion, froze. A dusty, dented Ford truck, the emblem of the county sheriff's department faded on its door, rolled to a stop just outside the corral. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence was deafening. The driver's side door opened with a weary groan, and a man unfolded himself from the cab. He was tall and rangy, his body weathered by the same sun and wind that scoured the plains. He wore a faded Stetson, and his face was a road map of long years and hard miles. His eyes, however, were sharp and clear, the color of a winter sky. They missed nothing. This was Sheriff Boone Callahan. He pushed his hat back on his head, his gaze sweeping across the scene in the yard, absorbing every detail with an almost lazy-seeming thoroughness that was anything but. He saw the woman, her face twisted in a mask of hate. He saw the little girl, pale and trembling, half hidden behind the legs of the giant horse. He saw the massive black stallion, standing like a sentinel, a piece of a leather strap still clenched in his teeth, and he saw the other half of the strap lying in the dust between the woman and the horse. Sheriff Callahan didn't say a word at first. He just looked, letting the silence press down, letting the story tell itself. He was a man who understood that the truth of a situation was rarely in the words people spoke, but in the spaces between them, in the posture of their bodies, in the look in their eyes. He had been on his way back from the Miller Ranch down the road when he'd heard the shriek cut through the air. It wasn't a sound of play. It was a sound of something breaking. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and low, a stark contrast to Magdalena's screech. "Morning, Magdalena. Everything all right out here?" Magdalena started as if waking from a trance. She smoothed her dress, trying to compose her features into a mask of beleaguered civility. "Sheriff, just some trouble with this animal." Her voice was tight, strained. "He's dangerous, unpredictable." Boone's eyes drifted from her face to the horse. Thunder hadn't moved. He still held the piece of strap, watching the woman. He seemed to regard the sheriff with a calm, assessing intelligence. Boone had seen a lot of horses in his life. He'd seen spooked horses, mean horses, and broken horses. This horse was none of those things. This horse looked like a judge. "Is that so?" Boone said, his gaze shifting to Clementine. "What about you, little one? You look a bit spooked." Clementine couldn't speak. She just stared, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was a force she didn't understand. An adult with a badge, a man who wasn't her father. Was he here to help? Or was he another part of the world that would not see, that would not listen? Boone's gaze fell again to the strap in the dust. He walked over to it slowly, bent down with a slight grunt, and picked it up. He examined the torn end. It wasn't a clean break. It was shredded, torn by something powerful. He looked at the matching piece in Thunder's mouth. The story was writing itself in plain, undeniable script. "This is a hell of a strap," Boone said, his voice still deceptively mild. He held it up. "Looks like it's seen a lot of use." He looked directly at Magdalena, and for the first time, his eyes held a glint of steel. Funny thing for a horse to do, though, tearing a strap like that. Almost like he was defending himself, or someone else. Magdalena's facade began to crack. A flicker of panic entered her eyes. The conflict was no longer a private horror contained within the fences of the homestead. The quiet, perceptive eyes of the law were upon her. The dynamic had shattered, and the pieces were falling in ways she could never have predicted. The standoff had begun. The air in the yard was thick with unspoken accusations. Sheriff Callahan held the two pieces of the torn strap, one in each hand, like a man weighing evidence. His silence was more potent than any question. It gave Magdalena the space to incriminate herself, and she dove into it head first. "That animal is a menace," she insisted, her voice rising again, laced with a frantic edge. "It tried to attack me. I was just trying to get it back in its stall, for her safety." She gestured vaguely towards Clementine, a desperate, theatrical motion. Boone's eyes didn't leave Magdalena's face. "The girl looks more scared of you than the horse, ma'am." He let the observation hang in the air. He turned his head slightly. "Clementine, is that what happened?" Clementine felt a knot of ice in her stomach. All her life, she had been taught that silence was survival. Speaking up, telling the truth, was a sin that brought swift and certain punishment. She looked from the sheriff's steady, patient gaze to Magdalena's burning glare, which promised a world of pain later, when the lawman was gone. The fear was paralyzing. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. But Boone saw it. He was a man accustomed to reading the faintest of signals. He saw the lie in Magdalena's frantic denial and the truth in the child's terrified silence. He looked back at Thunder. The stallion, as if sensing the turning of the tide, finally dropped the piece of leather from his mouth. It fell softly into the dust. He took a half-step closer to Clementine and nudged her back with his head, a clear, protective gesture. The horse was telling the story more plainly than any human could. "You know, Magdalena," Boone said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I've been the law in this county for 30 years. I've learned a thing or two, and one thing I've learned is that people and animals, they tend to get what they deserve. And this horse," he nodded at Thunder, "he doesn't look like a menace to me. He looks like he's protecting his own." The implication was a slap in the face. Magdalena's composure finally shattered completely. The fear in her eyes was replaced by the pure, blind fury of a cornered animal. She was losing. The narrative was slipping from her grasp, being rewritten by a silent child, a perceptive lawman, and an impossibly intelligent horse. Her authority, her control, the entire edifice of terror she had built, was crumbling. In that moment of total desperation, reason fled. All that was left was rage and the primal urge to destroy the source of her humiliation. Her eyes darted around the yard and then fixed on the house, on the rifle. Before Boone could react, she spun around and sprinted for the back door. It wasn't a retreat. It was an escalation. "Magdalena, stop right there," Boone commanded, his voice booming with authority now. But she was gone, disappearing into the dark maw of the kitchen. Clementine let out a small, terrified gasp. She knew what was in the house. She knew what Magdalena was going for. Boone didn't hesitate. He started moving towards the house, his hand already resting on the butt of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. "Clementine, you stay right there with that horse," he ordered, his eyes locked on the doorway. A moment later, Magdalena reappeared. She was framed in the doorway, a figure of pure malice, and in her hands she held Zeke Shaw's long-barreled hunting rifle. The sunlight glinted off the polished steel. Her face was a terrifying, contorted mess of sweat and hatred. "I'll kill it!" she screamed, her voice a raw, ragged sound. "I'll kill that goddamned beast!" She started to raise the rifle, fumbling with the stock, trying to bring it to her shoulder. Her target was clear. She was going to shoot Thunder. Clementine screamed, a full-throated, piercing shriek of pure terror and loss. "No!" Events compressed into a single heart-stopping second. Boone Callahan moved with the fluid grace of a man who had faced death before. There was no time to talk, no time to negotiate. There was only the glint of the rifle, the child's scream, and the woman's murderous intent. His hand blurred as he drew his revolver. The sound of his shot was a single, sharp crack that split the air, entirely different from the boom of the rifle he had just preempted. It was not a shot to kill. It was a shot of impossible surgical precision. The bullet struck the wooden stock of the rifle in Magdalena's hands. The impact sent a shockwave up her arms, and spun the weapon from her grasp. It clattered uselessly onto the wooden porch, the stock splintered and broken. Magdalena cried out, stumbling backward, staring at her stinging, empty hands in disbelief. She had been neutralized, but the judgment was not yet complete. The lawman had delivered his verdict on the weapon. Now the horse would deliver his verdict on the woman. Before the echo of the gunshot had even faded, Thunder moved. It was not a charge of blind panic from the loud noise. It was a surge of purpose, a black tempest. With a great snort that was more a roar of righteous fury than a sound of fear, he exploded forward. He leaped the low fence of the corral as if it were a twig, his massive body sailing through the air in a breathtaking display of power. He landed on the other side and charged, not at Boone, not at Clementine, but directly at Magdalena. Clementine screamed again, this time in fear for Magdalena. She thought he was going to trample her, to crush her into the dirt. But that was not his way. His justice was not crude. Magdalena, seeing the mountain of black fury thundering towards her, shrieked and scrambled backward into the house. She fell through the doorway, crab walking away from the terrifying apparition. Thunder didn't slow. He pounded across the porch, his hooves like hammers on the wood, and charged straight into the kitchen. He filled the doorway, his head and shoulders clearing it by inches, a mythic beast invading the sterile, mundane space of his tormentor. He stopped just inside, trapping her. Magdalena was backed against the far counter, near the sink where the innocent-looking wooden spoon still lay. Her face was bleached of all color, her eyes wide with a primal terror that went beyond the fear of pain. It was the fear of a higher, more absolute power. Thunder didn't touch her. He didn't bite or kick. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, his head lowered, his massive chest heaving. He filled the room with his presence, his scent, the sheer, overwhelming fact of his existence. He pinned her with his gaze, a gaze that held all the wrongs she had inflicted, all the pain, all the cruelty. He was her judge, jury, and jailer, all in one. He had cornered her in the very heart of her domestic tyranny, and in his magnificent, terrifying silence, he passed his sentence. The sentence was her own absolute, soul-shaking terror. She began to sob, not from remorse, but from the utter, helpless fear of a predator who has finally met a creature it cannot dominate. The armed standoff was over. The avenging fury had won. Sheriff Boone Callahan stood in the yard, his revolver still warm in his hand, watching the incredible scene unfold. He had seen many things, but never a horse that acted with such clear, righteous intent. He holstered his weapon and walked slowly towards the house. The sounds from the kitchen were a mixture of Magdalena's pathetic, gulping sobs and the horse's heavy, rhythmic breathing. He stopped at the doorway and looked in. Thunder didn't even turn his head. His focus was entirely on the woman he held captive. The scene was perfectly, poetically just. The monster was being held at bay by the one she had tried to destroy. Boone's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of finality. "Magdalena, it's over." She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were locked on the horse, on the great dark head, the flared nostrils, the intelligent, unblinking eyes that saw straight into the black pit of her soul. "Thunder," Boone said, his voice gentle. "Easy, boy. Let her go." As if he understood, the stallion took one slow, deliberate step backward, then another, extracting himself from the kitchen and backing out onto the porch. He never took his eyes off Magdalena until he was clear of the house. Then he turned his massive head and looked at Boone, a soft snort escaping his nostrils, a puff of air that seemed to say, "She's all yours." Boone stepped inside. Magdalena was slumped against the counter, a crumpled, weeping mess. The power, the cruelty, the sadistic confidence, it had all evaporated, leaving behind only a pathetic, cowardly core. "Get your things," Boone said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You're coming with me." Defeat settled over Magdalena like a shroud. There was no fight left in her, only a hollowed-out emptiness. She nodded meekly, her sobs subsiding into ragged, hiccuping breaths. Under the sheriff's watchful eye, she moved like an automaton, shuffling to her bedroom to pack a small bag. She seemed broken, a shadow of the tyrant she had been only minutes before. But the deepest evils do not break so easily, they merely change their shape. While she was in the bedroom, supposedly gathering her clothes, a different, more insidious thought began to form in the ruins of her mind. She had been beaten. She had been humiliated by a child, a lawman, and an animal. They had taken everything from her, her home, her authority, her dignity. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, venomous need for revenge. A final parting shot. If she was going to be cast out, she would leave a mark. She would poison the well. She would kill the source of her downfall. Her eyes scanned the room and fell on the closet. Behind a stack of old blankets on the top shelf was a small, dusty box. Rat poison. A fast-acting, vicious compound Zeke kept for the barn. Her mind, so recently shattered, was now terrifyingly clear. She emerged a few minutes later with a small carpet bag in her hand. Her face was a mask of tragic, false contrition. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were the tears of a performer. "Sheriff," she said, her voice a pathetic whisper. Can I just get a drink of water from the barn pump before we go? And maybe just a last look." Her voice trailed off, a perfect portrayal of a woman mourning the loss of her life. Boone was wary. His instincts told him this woman was a viper, but the request seemed harmless enough, and a small, misguided part of him felt a flicker of pity for the sheer totality of her collapse. "All right," he said, his voice gruff, "but I'm coming with you." Clementine had remained outside, her hand resting on Thunder's powerful shoulder, drawing strength from his warmth. The horse was calm now, but still alert, his ears swiveling, tracking every sound. She watched as Magdalena and the sheriff emerged from the house. She saw the bag in Magdalena's hand and felt a dizzying wave of relief. She was leaving. The nightmare was ending. Magdalena walked towards the barn, the sheriff a few paces behind her. She didn't look at Clementine or the horse. She moved with a strange, meek purposefulness. She passed the water pump and went straight to the barn doors, which still stood ajar. "Just need to check the feed bins," she mumbled, as if to herself. "Make sure they're secure from varmints." It was a plausible excuse. Boone stopped at the entrance, leaning against the frame, watching her. Inside the dim barn, Magdalena moved towards the row of wooden bins that held oats, corn, and sweet feed. Her back was to the sheriff. For a moment her hands were hidden from his view as she fumbled with the lid of the oat bin. Thunder's bin. Clementine saw it. It was a slight, furtive movement. From her angle she could see what Boone could not. She saw Magdalena's hand dip into the pocket of her dress and pull out a small, dark bottle. With a quick, practiced motion, she uncorked it with her teeth and upended it into the bin, a cascade of dark, granular powder mixing with the pale oats. She stirred it quickly with her hand, then closed the lid. It took less than 5 seconds. A silent, horrified scream lodged in Clementine's throat. She knew what she had seen. This wasn't a sad farewell. This was murder, a final, cowardly act of depravity. Magdalena turned, her face once again a mask of sorrow. "All set," she said softly, walking back towards the light of the doorway, towards the sheriff. But she had miscalculated. She had forgotten who else was watching. Thunder had seen it too, or perhaps he smelled it. The acrid chemical scent of the poison, an alien smell in his sanctuary of hay and honest grain. He had been standing placidly beside Clementine, but now his body went rigid. A low, guttural sound, more menacing than any noise he had made before, rumbled deep in his chest. Before Magdalena could take 2 steps, before Clementine could force a word past the terror in her throat, the horse acted. He strode forward, past Clementine, and into the barn. He walked directly to the oat bin. Without hesitation, he hooked his head under the heavy wooden lid and flipped it open with a loud bang. Then, with a deliberate, powerful swing of his head, he slammed the side of the bin. The entire wooden structure tipped over, crashing to the floor with a tremendous splintering sound. A river of oats and the dark, poisonous granules mixed within, poured out onto the dusty barn floor, clearly visible in the light from the door. But he wasn't finished. His intelligence, his righteous fury, had one final act. He lowered his head to the spilled mess. With his soft, prehensile nose, he nudged aside the grain until he found what he was looking for: the small, dark glass bottle that Magdalena had carelessly tossed into the bin along with its contents. He picked it up delicately between his lips. He turned, the bottle held gently in his mouth, and walked directly to Sheriff Boone Callahan. He stopped in front of the stunned lawman and lowered his head, dropping the poison bottle so that it landed softly in the dust by the sheriff's boots. The proof, undeniable, unspeakable, delivered by the intended victim. The silence that followed was absolute. Boone stared down at the bottle, then at the spilled, poisoned grain, then at the horse who stood before him like a delivering angel of truth. He bent down and picked up the bottle, uncorking it and sniffing the contents. His face, already grim, hardened into granite. He looked at Magdalena. The mask of the grieving victim was gone. The mask of the raging tyrant was gone. All that was left was the true face of evil, cold, reptilian, and utterly exposed. Her mouth was a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes, fixed on the horse, shone with a pure, undiluted hatred that was more chilling than any rage. She had been foiled, her deepest, most cowardly evil laid bare for the world to see, not by a person, but by the creature whose love for a child she had tried and failed to extinguish. The climax was complete. Not with a bang, but with the soft thud of a small glass bottle landing in the dust, an exclamation point on a story of ultimate depravity and astonishing justice. The ride away from the homestead was silent. Magdalena sat in the passenger seat of the Ford, her hands cuffed in front of her. The finality of her defeat had settled into a cold, dense lump in her chest. She did not look back. There was nothing left for her there but the ghosts of her own cruelty and the towering, silent judgment of a black stallion. Sheriff Callahan drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind replaying the events of the day: the torn strap, the rifle, the poison. He had seen a lot of badness in his life, but the cold, calculated nature of Magdalena's final act left a uniquely bitter taste in his mouth. He glanced at the small, dark bottle sitting on the dashboard, a testament to an evil so insidious it sought to kill with a secret parting blow. Back at the farm, Clementine stood beside Thunder, her small hand buried deep in his mane. The adrenaline that had flooded her system was gone, leaving behind a profound, shaky exhaustion. The world felt both terrifyingly new and blessedly quiet. The ever-present hum of fear that had been the soundtrack to her life was gone. In its place was a vast, echoing silence. She pressed her face into Thunder's warm, solid neck, and for the first time, it was not an act of hiding. It was an act of gratitude. She breathed in his familiar, earthy scent, and tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to fall, silent, hot trails through the dust on her cheeks. They were tears of terror, of relief, of a grief too old for her 8 years. Thunder stood perfectly still, absorbing her sorrow as he had always absorbed her fear, a living, breathing anchor in the swirling chaos of her world. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, when the sound of another engine reached them. It was Zeke's truck, rattling up the lane from the main road. Clementine's heart gave a painful lurch. Papa! He was coming home to a world that had been irrevocably broken and remade in his absence. How could she ever explain? Zeke Shaw climbed out of his truck, his body a study in weary angles. He was coated in a fine layer of black dust, his face smudged, his eyes tired. He saw the sheriff's truck was gone. He saw his daughter standing by the barn looking small and lost. He saw the splintered stock of his rifle lying on the porch. He saw the overturned feed bin. A cold dread, foreign and sharp, began to cut through his bone-deep fatigue. "Clem, what in God's name happened here?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and a dawning alarm. Clementine couldn't answer. The words were too big, too heavy. She just looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted. It was Sheriff Callahan who met him. He had doubled back after dropping Magdalena at the county jail, knowing this was a conversation that couldn't wait. He pulled up beside Zeke's truck, the dust from his arrival settling around the two men. "Zeke," Boone said, his voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk." They stood there in the dying light, between the silent house and the watchful barn, and Boone told him everything. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, laying out the facts like stones in a row. The strap, the escalating cruelty that he'd pieced together from the evidence and the child's terror, the rifle, the final damning proof of the poison. Zeke listened, his face slowly losing its color under the layer of coal dust. He shook his head, a gesture of disbelief, of denial. "No, not Maggie. She wouldn't—" But the words died in his throat. Because as he looked at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time in months, he saw it all. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched when he took a step towards her, the old faded bruises on her arms that he had dismissed as the clumsy marks of childhood. And he saw the fresh, angry welt from the wooden spoon, a mark he had somehow not seen that morning. The blindness had not been his daughter's. It had been his. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a mine collapse, burying him in the rubble of his own ignorance. He had worked to provide, to build a life, but he had failed in his most fundamental duty. He had failed to see. He had failed to protect. He had left his own child in the care of a monster, and he had been deaf to her silent screams. A great ragged sob tore from his chest. He stumbled forward and sank to his knees in the dust, his head in his hands, the weight of his guilt, a physical, crushing force. He had been a good man, but his goodness had been asleep. It had been absent, and in that absence, evil had flourished. Clementine watched her father weep. She had never seen him cry. She had never seen him look so broken. A part of her was angry, a cold, hard knot of resentment for all the times he hadn't seen. But another part of her, a part she didn't know she still possessed, felt a flicker of pity. He looked as lost as she felt. Slowly, hesitantly, she walked over to him. She stood before her kneeling, grieving father, a small, silent figure in the twilight. She didn't say, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. She didn't offer a hug. The space between them was a chasm of unspoken pain. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and gently, deliberately, pulled up the sleeve of her nightgown, showing him the raw, ugly mark from the spoon one more time. It was not an accusation. It was a testament. This was real. This happened. Zeke looked up, his face ravaged with grief, and his eyes met hers. In that look, a new understanding began to form. An apology that had no words, a promise that was just beginning to be written. The days that followed were quiet, fragile things. The house was cavernous without Magdalena's presence, the silence no longer fraught with danger, but filled with a strange, hollow emptiness that they didn't yet know how to fill. Zeke didn't go back to the mine for a week. He spent his days simply being present. He moved slowly, gently, as if afraid a sudden movement might shatter the delicate peace. He didn't try to force Clementine to talk. He just sat with her on the porch steps. He helped her with the chores, his large, clumsy hands relearning the simple domestic rhythms of the home he had abandoned to another's care. He started to see the world through her eyes. He noticed the single wildflower growing by the fence post, the way the light hit the hills in the morning. He was learning to see again. His true education, however, took place in the barn. He would go out and watch Clementine with Thunder. He saw the profound, non-verbal connection between them. He saw how the horse would lower his head to her, how she would whisper into his mane, how he would stand as a bastion of calm strength for her. He finally understood. The horse wasn't property. He wasn't a beast of burden or a potential profit. He was family. He was the guardian who had stood watch when he, the father, had been asleep. One evening, about a week after Magdalena was taken away, Zeke was mending the corral fence that Thunder had so spectacularly cleared. Clementine was grooming the stallion nearby, her small hands moving with practiced care. "He's a remarkable animal," Zeke said, his voice quiet. Clementine looked up, surprised he had spoken. She nodded. "He's my friend." Zeke hammered a nail into place, the sound sharp and clear in the evening air. "He's more than that, Clem. He's our hero." He looked at the horse, his eyes filled with a new, profound respect. "I owe him more than I can ever repay. I owe you more." He put the hammer down and walked over to her. He didn't try to hug her, not yet. He just stood beside her, looking at the great black horse. "I'm sorry, Clementine," he said, the words costing him everything and yet feeling like the first true thing he had said in years. "I'm so sorry I didn't see." Clementine looked at her father's tired, earnest face. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse. She reached out a small, hesitant hand and placed it on his arm. It was a tiny gesture, but it was a beginning, a bridge across the chasm. The story of the Shaw homestead became a quiet legend in the county. The story of the cruel stepmother, the wise sheriff, and the horse that delivered justice. But for Clementine and Zeke, it was just life. A new life, built one splintered board and one healed scar at a time. The oppressive fear was gone, replaced by a tentative, hard-won peace. The home was no longer a prison, but a place that was slowly, painstakingly, being reclaimed. The story ends not with a grand resolution, but with a simple, recurring image. Every evening as the sun sets, Clementine goes to the barn. She presses her face into Thunder's powerful neck, breathing in his scent of hay and strength and loyalty. But now, she is not hiding from a monster. She is connecting with her savior. And often, her father stands in the doorway, not intruding, but simply watching, his heart filled with a painful, beautiful gratitude. He watches the unbreakable bond between the child and the horse, the bond that had shone a light into the darkness and brought him home. The landscape, once so bleak and oppressive, now holds the quiet, lyrical promise of hope. Trust, home, and love were not things that had been given to them. They were things they were building together, one day at a time, in the long, peaceful shadow of the great black horse.